مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. كتب فرانك فوريدي أستاذ علم الاجتماع في مقال بصحيفة ديلي ميل أن الأكثر إثارة للصدمة في هجوم الجمعة على سلمان رشدي ليس أنه حدث في المقام الأول، فقد قضى المؤلف جزءا كبيرا من حياته مهددا بالاغتيال، لكن ما أدهشه بالفعل هو رد الفعل في بعض الأوساط على محاولة قتل الروائي خاصة من اليسار. أنوه إلى أن المقال متوفر مترجم على موقعنا السياق.com. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا من لندن البروفيسور فرانك فوريدي أستاذ علم الاجتماع بجامعة كانت في كانتبري. بروفيسور فرانك مرحبا بك معنا.
Pleasure to talk with you.
كتبت أن الأكثر إثارة للصدمة في هجوم الجمعة ليس حدوثه في المقام الأول بل رد الفعل في أوساط اليسار. ما الذي تقصده هنا؟
I think that the sections of the left have become very uncomfortable with the idea of free speech and free expression over the last decade or so. And as a result, when they reacted and they heard what happened, it was almost like they tried to pretend that this wasn't a big deal, as if this was just maybe a crazy person doing something strange. And in a sense, what they were trying to do was to somehow minimize the significance of this attack upon a writer, upon a novelist, not realizing that actually what was going on was an assault on the freedom of journalists and authors and writers, of anybody, to express controversial and unpopular views. And in that sense, I was a little bit taken aback because I was expecting a much more robust condemnation of this attack from the left.
طيب باعتقادك لماذا اختار اليسار المسيطر على معظم مؤسسات الإعلام في بريطانيا والعالم هذا الاتجاه؟ لماذا لم يسمي الأشياء بأسمائها؟
I think what's happened is that since the original publication of Salman Rushdie's book, the situation, particularly with the left, has gotten worse and worse, because there was a time when left-wing people were very much for freedom of expression, free speech. But gradually over the decades, they began to regard free speech as not a big deal. Often they would say that freedom of speech can, for example, hurt people, offend people, particularly offend the kind of groups that the left liked. Felt that if, for example, you criticize somebody, then the minority groups in American or English society would feel hurt and aggrieved. And as a result of that, they kind of gradually moved in a direction of attacking people who they felt were using speech in a way they didn't like. And you can see this very, very clearly in the publishing world, where within the publishing world, in publishing houses now, there's a very rigorous campaign of censorship. They have what's called sensitivity readers. People read manuscripts to see if the words in the manuscript might offend a gay person, or might offend a black person, or might offend a woman, or might offend anybody really. And sometimes they kind of argue and they want to reject the books. So even famous authors have been targeted. So J.K. Rowling was publishing a children's story last year, and in the publishing house, some of the young people who were working there saying, "We're not going to touch it. We're not going to work with J.K. Rowling. We don't like what she says about trans people, and therefore her book should not see the light of day." So that kind of attitude is really, really powerful. And so many books, including Salman Rushdie's, that could be published 20, 30 years ago, will never see the light of day today.
أنت تؤكد أن كتاب آيات شيطانية ما كان لينشر اليوم؟
Not unless you got some kind of brave, small publishing house on the margins of the publishing world. I think the mainstream publishers would find a very good excuse for resisting the temptation. I think that this is particularly the case in the Anglo-American world. It might be a little bit different in other parts of the world, but certainly in Canada, Australia, America, England, there's a a very high level of intellectual and moral cowardice when it comes to publishing controversial matters.
هل حرية التعبير يمكن أن تتجزأ أيا كانت الأسباب؟
I don't think the freedom of speech can be divisible without losing its foundational norm, because you can't have free speech on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, but not on Thursday and Friday. And you can't have free speech towards people that you like, but not towards people that you don't like. Because you have to remember that the very idea of free speech emerged because we recognized that words are powerful, words can hurt, words can sometimes lead to a lot of pain and conflict. And we recognized that despite the power of words, it was far better and in a society to be open and to learn how to discuss and to debate than to shut things down. And I think that was really quite important, because we also recognized that freedom itself in all of its manifestation ultimately depends on free speech. Because if you can't open your mouth, if you can't say what you believe in, then all the other freedoms become meaningless. They don't really mean very much. And I think for that reason, I would suggest that you cannot be selective about freedom. We have to learn to be grown up and live with the fact that sometimes the words you use might hurt me, might give me pain. But nevertheless, in the course of dealing with that pain, discussing, clarifying, we learn to develop a kind of a mature and grown-up society.
كتب سايمون جانكيز في الجارديان هذا الأسبوع مقالا بعنوان هل تريد أن تزدهر حرية التعبير؟ إذن لابد من تنظيمها. هل تشعر بالتناقض هنا مثلي؟
I certainly do, because when you police speech, because that's what regulation is all about, then what you're saying is that your freedom to decide for yourself what you can and cannot say is taken away from you. And I think that there's an expression that people like him use in the English language. They use the expression, I believe in freedom of speech, but. And it's the but that's important. So when you say, I believe in free speech, but, what comes after the but that negates your initial remark about believing in free speech. Because if you qualify free speech, what you really are saying is that freedom is always subject to somebody saying no, somebody restricting it and restraining it. And that's what we're seeing in many parts of the world now, especially in Anglo-American universities. A lot of my students come to me and they say, Professor Fوريدي, do you think I can say this? I don't know whether I'm allowed to express myself in this way. And that to me is a terrible problem, because one of the nice things about being in a university, certainly when I was a student, is I could say whatever I wanted. That freedom to express myself, to follow my thoughts and my ideas, was what was so exciting about my university life, rather than having to conform and to police myself.
كتبت أن اليسار استرضى المتطرفين وتملقهم مدة طويلة. كيف حدث ذلك؟
I don't know if they like them. I think it's more a question of acquiescence and moral cowardice. So, for example, I remember being involved in a debate, and some of the people I was debating on the left were saying that there's something, not right about openly criticizing jihadists. They basically said that that's something that only makes matters worse. And very often they would say, Frank, you're being a little bit silly because you have to be polite. And it's far better that we don't get into arguments and criticize them, because if they do, then that will create all kinds of problems. And so what happens as a result of this, just to give you an example in the university, is that some of my colleagues in the university, when they are discussing sort of certain issues in a seminar, suppose they're discussing the Holocaust, and there are some radical Islamic students in the seminar, and the students object to that, and they say, well, the Holocaust never happened, it's silly, stupid. Instead of saying, no, that's not right, that's wrong, they will just shut up and be too embarrassed to pursue that discussion. So I think that there's a kind of, on the one hand, a cowardice, and at the same time, some of the left-wing people think that anybody that hates our government or despises, the British or the American way of life, no matter what their origins are, what their intentions are on our side. And I think that sentiment is really, so basically there's an argument they put forward, and this is a classical left-wing argument in Britain. They basically see that the problem of right-wing terrorism in this country, which is almost non-existent, is worse than jihadist terrorism, because what they are really trying to say is that the problem is the right, rather than anything else. And there's a kind of high level of dishonesty that has become institutionalized when it comes to questioning or criticizing certain kinds of political movements.
حتى نضع النقاط على الحروف، أنت تخبرني أننا تراجعنا في مجال حرية التعبير كثيرا مقارنة بالماضي، سواء في ساحة الإعلام أو في مجال الأكاديميا.
Yes, I think that if you were to compare the moral authority of freedom 30 years ago to now, you'll find that it's diminished quite considerably. And you'll find that if you look at, for example, surveys that have been carried out, particularly among young people, a very high percentage, 35, 40% say that free speech is not a big thing, that free speech is overrated. In America, there are some people that actually go so far as to argue that free speech is the same thing as hate speech, because you kind of, by arguing whatever you want, you're creating hate. So rather than understanding that freedom of speech is the most creative way of exploring ideas, they are actually behaving as if they were medieval clerics or medieval censors who are kind of shutting things down. And the one point they don't understand, which is that every single idea that humanity has ever invented that was important and was good offended somebody. It wouldn't have been a good idea if everybody just accepted it. And now, precisely when we don't want to be offended, what we are really saying is we want to put a stop to the creation and the development of new exciting ideas.
في ختام مقالك ربطت تقييد حرية التعبير بخنق النقاش بشأن مواضيع مثل السيادة التايوانية والتبتية والإبادة الجماعية لسكان الصين المسلمين من الإيغور. هل لك أن تشرح ذلك؟
Absolutely, because there are very many difficult and controversial issues that people would rather not talk about. I think that happens in every society. Things that are embarrassing, sort of there are, in a sense, a scandal. And we had a situation, for example, in some universities where the Chinese government intervened and told the university professors not to criticize Chinese domestic policy about this or that matter. And rather than tell the Chinese government to go away and mind their own business, people began to moderate what they were saying. So what you then end up doing is you have a situation where there's a kind of implicit assumption that there's all these issues and themes that are beyond discussion. We cannot really touch them. We create a quarantine around difficult, controversial subjects, and we're not going to touch them. And when that happens, then the quality of public life diminishes quite dramatically, and we become impoverished intellectually and politically as a result of that.
باعتقادك هل ما يزال العالم الحر أو الغرب أهلا للإمساك بمعيار حرية التعبير وانتقاد باقي الدول حولها، باعتبار أن حرية التعبير باتت مهددة فيه أيضا؟ هناك الكثير من المواضيع التي لا تستطيع فتحها في أمريكا أو بريطانيا.
Well, I do. I think that the situation is much, much worse, and sometimes, the lack of openness reminds me of when I traveled in parts of Africa and Asia or in the Middle East in the past. I'm reminded of the way that I had to watch my words and be very careful in order not to get into trouble. I think that the big difference is that the kind of trouble you get into in England is a little bit different than the kind of trouble you get into in Russia or in, say, Egypt. You know, because in a place like Egypt or Russia, you can really come to harm, physical harm as well. Whereas in England, it hasn't yet come to the point where you go to jail. I mean, some people do go to jail, very few, but by and large, it's you lose your job. I mean, that's the penalty you pay. You lose your job, you lose your means of livelihoods. So, you know, there is not a qualitative difference, but there's still an important difference. And I'm saying this not to excuse what's going on here, because I think that you would expect that in the Western world, given the importance that is historically attached to free speech, you expect them to uphold that rather than to give it up. Whereas in the third world, they haven't had that in the past. So I can understand why it's much more difficult there to create a culture which is genuinely committed to the freedom of expression.
إيه، لكن عند الغرب أيضا هناك ثقافة الإلغاء ولها عواقب وخيمة وحملات كراهية على وسائل التواصل تدفع بالضحايا للانتحار أحيانا، فالعواقب وخيمة في دول الغرب أيضا. لكن السؤال هنا، هل بعد حادثة سلمان رشدي بات الغرب أكثر إدراكا لمعضلة تراجع حرية التعبير فيه؟
Unfortunately, I think that there's a big battle to be had to defend free speech. And at the moment, the cultural forces that want to police freedom of expression are relatively powerful, and people like myself who are fighting back against that are very much in the minority. There is a growing minority of people who want to stand up and preserve that dignity that comes with freedom of expression. But it's going to be a very difficult and long-term battle, because when you look at the big institutions, from the American corporations all the way to the American state, all the way to the cultural institutions like universities, museums, same thing in England, they've all gone on the dark side, and they've all accepted that policing speech, regulating speech is the way forward. And therefore, I don't think there's going to be a big shift in consciousness because of the horrific attack upon Salman Rushdie. That's not going to happen. I think that we're going to have to need much more campaigning, much more struggling in order to win the hearts and minds of people who matter.
شكرا جزيلا لك بروفيسور فرانك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Pleasure. Nice talking to you.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.